The microphone hit the floor. Jimmy Fallon stepped back from his desk, his signature smile vanishing as Tom Cruise's eyes filled with tears. In that moment, 200 audience members witnessed something they never expected, one of Hollywood's most controlled superstars breaking down over a simple object that a production assistant had accidentally left on the coffee table. What happened next would be talked about for years. But to understand why this moment shattered every protocol in late-night television, we need to go back 3 hours earlier, when Jimmy Fallon was preparing for what he thought would be just another celebrity interview. It was 3 p.m. on a Tuesday when Jimmy walked into Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Tom Cruise was scheduled to appear that evening to promote his latest Mission Impossible film, and everything seemed routine. The production team had gone through their usual checklist. Camera angles perfected, lighting adjusted, and Jimmy's note cards filled with the standard mix of movie promotion questions and light-hearted anecdotes designed to showcase Cruise's charm. But hidden in the audience that night was Danny Chen, a 34-year-old teacher from Queens who had been fighting stage 4 cancer for 8 months. Her students had pooled their lunch money together to buy her a ticket to see her favorite talk show host, Jimmy Fallon, believing that laughter might be the medicine she needed most. What no one knew was that Sarah had brought with her a letter written by her late father, a stuntman who had worked on 3 Tom Cruise films in the 1990s. It was the last thing he had given her before his death in a motorcycle accident 10 years earlier. The letter, creased from being folded and unfolded countless times, contained his proudest moment, a handwritten note from Tom Cruise thanking him for his dedication and calling him one of the bravest people I've ever worked with. As the show began, Jimmy launched into his monologue with his usual energy. The audience laughed, Tom Cruise made his entrance to thunderous applause, and everything proceeded exactly as scripted. They talked about impossible stunts, discussed Tom's preparation methods, and Jimmy even attempted to recreate one of the movie's action sequences with predictably hilarious results. But 23 minutes into the interview, something happened that would change everything. A production assistant, cleaning up between commercial breaks, accidentally knocked Sarah's purse from her lap in the front row. The contents scattered, and among them was her father's letter. The assistant, apologizing profusely, quickly gathered the items and placed them on the guest coffee table next to Tom Cruise's water glass, intending to return them after the show. Neither Jimmy nor Tom initially noticed the folded piece of paper with Tom Cruise written in faded blue ink across the top. When they returned from commercial break, Jimmy was in the middle of asking about Tom's next project when the actor's gaze drifted to the coffee table. His eyes locked onto the letter, and his animated explanation of helicopter stunts suddenly stopped mid-sentence. The color drained from his face as he recognized his own name written in handwriting he hadn't seen in over a decade. "I'm sorry," Tom said quietly, his voice barely audible through the microphone. "Jimmy, is that?" He pointed to the letter, his hands slightly trembling. Jimmy followed Tom's gaze, confused. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Tom. Should we?" Tom reached for the letter before Jimmy could finish his sentence. As he unfolded it, his eyes began to well up with tears. "This is about Danny Chen," he whispered, reading the letter. He was one of my stunt coordinators. He died 10 years ago." The studio fell silent. Jimmy looked at his guest cards, then at his producers, uncertain how to handle this unexpected turn. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't part of the show. This was something real, something raw, something that television rarely allowed space for. But Jimmy Fallon didn't reach for his cards or look to his producers for guidance. Instead, he did something that would define his legacy as more than just an entertainer. He chose empathy over entertainment. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Jimmy quietly signaled to his band leader, Questlove, to stop the background music. He then did something unprecedented. He stood up from behind his desk, walked over to Tom's chair, and sat down on the coffee table directly in front of his guest, abandoning every rule of late-night television staging. "Tell me about Danny," Jimmy said softly, his voice gentle and encouraging. Tom looked up from the letter, tears now visible on his cheeks. Danny was fearless. He would do stunts that other coordinators wouldn't even attempt. But more than that, he was kind. He had a daughter he talked about constantly. Sarah. He showed me pictures of her every day on set. Jimmy's head turned toward the audience, scanning the faces until his eyes met Sarah's. She was crying now, holding her hand over her mouth in disbelief. Without hesitation, Jimmy walked down into the audience and approached her. Are you Sarah? He asked quietly, kneeling beside her seat. She nodded, unable to speak. Would you like to come up and meet Tom? What happened next wasn't television. It was humanity at its purest. Jimmy helped Sarah onto the stage, where Tom Cruise immediately stood and embraced her, both of them crying openly. The letter, the same letter her father had treasured for years, was now back in the hands of the man who had written it, creating a circle of connection that transcended the boundaries between celebrity and civilian, between performer and audience. Tom spoke directly to Sarah about her father's courage, sharing stories that had never been told in any interview. He described how Danny had saved another stuntman's life during a particularly dangerous sequence, and how his attention to detail had prevented countless accidents on set. Most importantly, he told Sarah that her father had spoken about her with such pride that everyone on the crew knew about the little girl who wanted to be a teacher. Jimmy, rather than rushing to commercial break, or trying to steer the conversation back to the movie promotion, simply sat quietly and let this moment unfold. He understood that sometimes the most powerful thing a host can do is create space for authentic human connection. The audience was completely silent except for the occasional sniffle. Cameras continued rolling, capturing something unscripted and unrehearsed. This wasn't entertainment. This was life happening in real time, with all its mess and beauty and unexpected grace. Behind the scenes, network executives were frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial, but Jimmy had already made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He was going to let this moment be exactly what it needed to be, regardless of time constraints or promotional obligations. Tom asked Sarah about her teaching, about her students, about her father's legacy in her life. She told him about her cancer diagnosis, about how her students had bought her the ticket to the show, about how she carried her father's letter everywhere as a reminder of his love and her own strength. That's when Tom Cruise did something that surprised everyone, including Jimmy. He took off his watch, a vintage Rolex that he'd worn to every film premiere for the past 15 years, and placed it in Sarah's hands. Your father gave me something I could never repay, Tom said. He gave me confidence in my own courage by showing me what real bravery looked like. This watch has been with me through every stunt, every premiere, every important moment in my career since then. I want you to have it, not because it's expensive, but because it's been touched by the same fearlessness that your father had. Jimmy, who had seen countless celebrity gestures over the years, knew this was different. This wasn't a publicity stunt or a calculated move. This was Tom Cruise giving away something genuinely meaningful because a moment of authentic connection demanded nothing less than authenticity in return. The audience began to applaud, but it wasn't the usual enthusiastic clapping of a TV studio audience. It was the kind of applause reserved for profound moments, slow, reverent, acknowledging that they had witnessed something sacred. Jimmy made his way back to his desk, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he addressed the camera directly. Sometimes, he said, his voice thick with emotion, television gives us the chance to remember what really matters. Tonight we were supposed to talk about movies and stunts and Hollywood glamour. Instead, we got to witness love that transcends death, courage that inspires generations, and kindness that reminds us why we tell stories in the first place. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. The segment that was supposed to run 8 minutes had stretched to 25. Commercial breaks had been missed. The carefully planned show rundown had been completely abandoned. And yet, nobody in that studio wanted it to end. Tom spent another 10 minutes talking with Sarah, asking about her treatment, her prognosis, her hopes. Jimmy facilitated the conversation like a counselor rather than a talk show host, asking thoughtful questions and creating space for genuine dialogue. When Sarah mentioned that her biggest regret was that her father would never see her publish the children's book she'd been writing about courage, Tom pulled out his phone. "What's your publisher's name?" he asked. "I don't have one yet," Sarah admitted. "I've been too sick to really pursue it seriously." Tom looked at Jimmy, then back at Sarah. "By tomorrow morning you'll have 5 publishers calling you. I guarantee it." And he meant it. Tom Cruise spent the rest of that interview using his platform not to promote his movie, but to promote Sarah's book, her story, and her father's legacy. He talked about how Hollywood needs more stories like hers, stories that remind us that the real heroes aren't the ones on movie screens, but the ones in classrooms and hospitals and everyday life. When the show finally ended, Tom didn't rush off to his next appearance. He stayed with Sarah for another hour, looking at photos of her father, hearing stories about her students, and making phone calls to ensure that her book would find a publisher and her medical bills would be covered. Jimmy, who could have easily moved on to his next segment or worried about the show's pacing, instead sat with them, occasionally asking questions but mostly just bearing witness to a conversation that was healing decades-old wounds and creating new connections. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The impact of that night extended far beyond Studio 6B. The unedited footage of Tom and Sarah's conversation was posted online and viewed over 50 million times in the first week. Publishers did indeed call Sarah, and her book, Letters from Brave Dads, became a bestseller, with proceeds going to families of stunt performers who had been injured or killed on film sets. But perhaps more importantly, that night changed how Jimmy Fallon approached his role as a host. He realized that his platform could be used for more than just entertainment. It could be a space for healing, for connection, for the kind of authentic human moments that television often sacrifices for the sake of pacing and promotion. Tom Cruise never promoted another movie without also highlighting the crew members who made his stunts possible. He established a foundation in Danny Chen's name that provides educational scholarships for children of film industry workers. And Sarah? She survived her cancer treatment and returned to teaching, but she also became an advocate for courage in the face of impossible odds. She still wears Tom's watch every day, not as a celebrity memento, but as a reminder that kindness and connection can appear in the most unexpected moments. The letter that started it all now sits framed in Sarah's classroom, next to a photo of her father and a signed picture from that night at The Tonight Show. Her students often ask about the story behind the objects, and Sarah tells them about the night when television became real, when celebrity became human, and when a simple piece of paper connected hearts across decades and distances. Jimmy Fallon keeps a photo from that night on his dressing room mirror. Not the posed publicity shot, but a candid moment captured by a crew member showing Tom, Sarah, and Jimmy sitting together in a circle of chairs, talking like old friends rather than host, guest, and audience member. That photo reminds Jimmy every night before he goes on stage that his job isn't just to make people laugh. Sometimes, his job is to make space for people to cry, to heal, to connect, and to remember that behind every story, every joke, and every interview is a human being with a history worth honoring. The object that changed everything, Danny Chen's letter to Tom Cruise, became a symbol of how love and recognition can travel across time, connecting strangers through shared respect for courage and kindness. It proved that sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones we plan to tell, but the ones that emerge when we're brave enough to let real life interrupt our carefully scripted performances. That night, Jimmy Fallon didn't just host a talk show. He created a space where healing could happen, where celebrity meant using your platform for connection rather than promotion, and where a father's love could reach across death to embrace his daughter one more time.